can't think of anything worse than losing a child. A previous guest on the show, award-winning actor Jason Watkins, talked on this podcast about losing his 2.5-year-old daughter Maudie to sepsis. The pain must be unbearable. Child Bereavement UK is a quite brilliant charity that supports children, young people, parents and families when either a child grieves or a child dies. For the last 3 years, my daughters and I have had the privilege of singing at their annual carol concert in December, and the outpouring of thanks from parents and families about how child bereavement has supported them and continues to support them in the worst of all circumstances is truly humbling, moving, and inspiring. If you know of someone in these circumstances who needs their help, or if you'd like to support the work that they do, either by donating or giving your time, please contact them via their website, www.childbereavementuk.org. Every penny and every effort will make a difference. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about creatives and rock stars of life. For the last 3 years, my daughters and I have had the privilege of singing at the carol concert for Child Bereavement UK. It is the most incredible evening. Amazing performances from stars and heartfelt testimonies from parents who have faced the worst cards dealt anyone, those of losing a child. I had the most lovely conversation with my guest today in the performers' dressing room before the concert, and she very modestly told me she was a writer. She was so modest, I could almost have thought she'd written one book and perhaps a handful of people had read it. She was on stage later, bravely and generously talking about losing her son Alex, sharing her story to provide solace and reassurance to others dealing with such loss. There's that expression, walking around with your head in the sand, which often applies to me, and in my case, my whole body was buried under that sand, as when I looked her up, I recognised her book covers immediately, as her books are always amongst the top 10 bestsellers displayed in bookshops. She is a multi-award-winning, best-selling author whose 10 books to date have sold over 2 million copies in over 40 countries, and has spent a combined total of 67 weeks in the Sunday Times bestseller chart. I have now read 5 of her books, although I'm not sure read is the correct verb. Devoured would be more accurate. She is the queen of the twist, meticulously leading you up the garden path before slamming you with a curveball I defy anyone to guess beforehand. I don't know how she keeps coming up with them. At the time of this recording, her latest book, the third in the DC Fionn Morgan series, Other People's Houses, came out 2 weeks ago. What is well known about her is that writing is her second career. Her first was working on the police force, and she also writes for The Guardian, Good Housekeeping, and many other publications. She's also the founder of the Chipping Norton Literary Festival. But what is less well known is that, like me, she is a committed cold water swimmer. Having been a total dunce first time round, I am so excited and feel very lucky to chat again to Clare Mackintosh. Clare, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. You are definitely not a dunce, but it's really lovely to be here. Also, I learned recently that I have now sold 3 million books.
Oh my gosh, that's not even a slight change. That's a big change.
I know. I mean, I don't think it's jumped instantly from 2 to 3, but I clearly need to update my bio.
Yes. You're living currently in North Wales. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the home counties, so Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, and went to university in Surrey. And so everything was very south-based.
You studied French and management, didn't you, at university, but went straight into the police force, I think I'm right in saying, afterwards.
Yes.
I think becoming a member of the police, a bit like being an actor or a musician or a doctor, it's a proper vocation. When did you know that's what you wanted to do?
Well, I joined the police by accident.
Did you?
Yes.
No, I didn't know that.
It's the most ridiculous story. I was at Royal Holloway University, so part of London's university, which is out in Egham in Surrey. And I had actually gone to university to do French and German and then panicked a bit. My German wasn't up to it and switched, did business and just didn't know what I wanted to do. And someone had suggested that maybe I could become a management consultant. A lot of business graduates were doing that. And so I went along to a talk in my final year at uni to find out about joining one of these big consultancy firms. And I was late and I couldn't find the lecture theatre. And when I eventually got in, ran up, apologised, sat at the back. And I looked up and I was in the wrong room. It was a talk being delivered by the Home Office on joining the graduate scheme on what was then called the Accelerated Promotion Scheme. And I was so British that I didn't leave. I didn't want to make a fuss. So I just stayed and listened. And then something extraordinary happened. And I had been struggling a little bit with the idea of doing a career that was just about making money for you and for other people. And my father was an NHS doctor. And I think just our whole sort of family ethos was really about helping people. And so I had been struggling with that. And what flicked the switch, I suppose, for me it was two things. It was firstly the realization that here was a career that would make a difference. And the second was the variety of jobs within one career. And oddly enough, that had been what had attracted me to being a management consultant, was parachuting in, doing different jobs, always doing the same role, but in very different ways. And I thought, well, I could do this in the police. And then the clincher was, they said at the end, look, we're here to talk to you about the Accelerated Promotion Scheme, but you should know that the odds of getting on are incredibly small. We are anticipating between 3,000 and 5,000 applicants this year, and we will take a handful. So take the form, because it was all paper application forms, take the form, but also take a form for the regular entry route. So I didn't take the regular entry route. And I was one of 12 that year who was selected to join the graduate fast track. You know, I don't know what would have happened if I'd gone into any other room, whether I would have had an accidental career in something else. It feels as though it was just meant to be on that particular day.
Yes. Well, I did go into management consultancy, so I can absolutely tell you without a shadow of a doubt that would have been the wrong thing to do, because I did not like it. And then I became a teacher afterwards, which I liked a lot better.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think sometimes these things are meant to be. What did you like most about the job once you were in it?
I liked that knowledge that however bad my day was, I was making life better for someone else. And that is such a privilege and something that you don't get in very many jobs. You get it in service jobs, essentially, in jobs like teaching, like customer services, like the police, like medical professionals. But a lot of people don't experience that. When they have a bad day, they just have a bad day. And so I liked that. I did like the variety. I also liked the headache of solving problems, whether that was solving a crime or latterly, as I got promoted, at a more strategic level of solving a policing problem or a resourcing problem or a public order problem.
You were posted to Chipping Norton as a town sergeant to start with, and then you rapidly rose through the ranks and you ended up being the operations inspector for Thames Valley Police.
For Oxfordshire, within Thames Valley Police. I did lots of different roles and loved them all. I loved being a detective on CID. The thing about the Accelerated Promotion Scheme was that you were dropped into different departments and promoted very quickly. And it turned out that I didn't like that. And I actually withdrew from the graduate scheme. I discovered that I didn't agree with it, that actually I felt people needed to do a bit longer at grassroots level before getting promoted. And once I realised I didn't agree with the scheme, it felt disingenuous to be on it. And so I withdrew from it. And actually, it made no difference to my career. I got promoted on my merit. But it made a difference to me to know that I'd boarded for that position and hadn't just been given it. At the end of my career, I worked a little bit for the Chief Constable on a big restructuring, budget slashing project, which was challenging emotionally for a lot of people. You're removing jobs and, that's hard.
Well, it's management consultancy for the police.
Yes, it is, absolutely. And then I found my niche. I loved public order. So what I did was I managed the policing response to large public events. So that could be anything from a festival in a park to a football match with anticipated violence or a protest, a demonstration, anything where you've got large numbers of people. And it was fascinating because it involved two different types of decision making. There was the proactive decision making where you looked at the information you had in advance and you decided what resources you want and you formulated a plan for how this event was going to go down. And then, of course, you would be at the event and everything would go completely to shit. And you'd have to make really, really rapid decisions about how you were going to handle people throwing burning bottles at you or bricks. I really enjoyed that. It was a good career and I was very ambitious and driven and really gave it 100%.
If you could change one thing about the police, what would you change?
Oh, gosh. I mean, look, a lot. I think probably the single most important thing the police could do is to recruit more diversely, I think. And they're trying. They really are trying, but they need to try harder and they need to keep trying, because until we have a police force that actually represents the demographic of the communities they police, we won't have true trust in the police and they won't understand what the people actually want and need.
You had your children when you were a police officer. You were the police for 12 years. I want to mention your book, I Promise It Won't Always Hurt This Much, which is 18 assurances on grief. You had your twin boys prematurely and Alex died at 5 weeks old. I read the book. It's a wonderful book. It's a lifeline, I would imagine, for people who are put in the worst of circumstances, that of losing a child. There's also a lot of hope in it. Also really important, I think, for friends who want to help and really don't know how. Could you tell us, first of all, what happened to Alex?
Yes, of course. So I'd had fertility treatment and been incredibly fortunate to fall pregnant on our only round of IVF. And when I was 24 weeks pregnant, my waters broke and I was rushed into hospital and told that I would stay there until the babies arrived, which I did. And they hung on till just under 28 weeks, went into neonatal intensive care and were doing really well, actually, for such premature babies. But then when they were 3 weeks old, Alex contracted meningitis. He picked up a hospital bug and got progressively worse. And for a while, we thought he would survive, but potentially have brain damage. And then when he was 5 weeks old, he suffered a huge brain hemorrhage, which affected every part of his brain. And we were asked to make a decision about his treatment. Either we continue to keep him alive and accept that if he lived longer than a few months, that he would be unlikely to walk or talk, to hear, to see, to swallow, really to have any awareness of the world around him. There was a possibility that that was the wrong prognosis, because miracles happen all the time, but that was their prognosis at the time. Alternatively, we could choose to turn off his life support machines and let him die. And so that's what we did. And when he was 5 weeks old, he was taken away from the machines and given to us in a little room, and we waited for him to die.
That seems of cruelty to be given that choice at the end of it all, because even though you know you've made the right choice, that must play out in your mind.
It's really hard. Yeah, really hard. I think very often when we're in a medicalised situation like that, and this is true whether it's your child in hospital, an elderly relative, a partner, the doctors are making all the decisions. You're not the one saying, I think we need a little bit more of this medicine or more IV drip here. They're doing all of that. And you are totally disempowered. All you can do is sit by their bedside and hope that everything's going to be okay. But then suddenly the tables are turned and you are the only one who can make the decision about whether to turn off the machines. The enormity of that decision was just horrific. And we talked a lot together. And then I phoned my father. As I said, my father was a doctor, and I just needed his advice. And he talked to me a lot about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. But he also said, look, when you're making this decision, you're not only thinking about Alex and the life that he would have, you need to also think about what it would do to you as a family. What life would you be giving Alex's twin brother, Josh? And also think about, if you were to keep Alex alive, is that something you're doing for him or is that something you're doing for you? And, you know, it never really crossed my mind that... So I had gone to my father because I wanted my dad's advice. And he was so good. I never once sort of realised that, of course, he was talking about his grandson.
Yes.
And that was a really tough thing, a tough position to put him in. And he was so brilliant.
In that first year, and years, when I imagine you just don't feel like you can go on, suffocating, overwhelming, just pain, looking back on that very raw period of time now, what advice would you give to somebody? What, if anything, can they do?
It's just about survival. That's all it is. It's just about survival. It is taking each day as it comes, each hour, each minute. It is absolutely just forcing yourself to put one foot in front of the other, to keep taking a breath and not thinking about the future. And that future might just be this afternoon. I don't remember it very clearly. It was such an extraordinary time, not least because we still had Alex's twin brother in intensive care. And so the day after Alex died was the same routine that we'd had. I got up and drove to the hospital and walked past an empty crib and sat next to my surviving son and just kept going. And it was a very long time before surviving became living, and an even longer time before it became thriving.
Not long afterwards, you then discovered you're expecting twins again. So not only are you in the middle of that grief, but then you must have that absolute terror that history is going to repeat itself.
Oh, completely. I tried to get off the table when they scanned me. I had insisted on an early scan because I was so convinced that I would have twins again and history would repeat itself. And everybody kept saying, no, this is a natural miracle. You only had twins because it was fertility treatment. And then there they were, these two heartbeats. And I really struggled. I struggled with the pregnancy. I struggled with the whole concept of being pregnant again. I catastrophized constantly for a very long time. And when they were born healthily at term, I expected them to die all the time.
I'm sure I can totally understand that.
And I don't think you would have known it. If you'd known me at the time, you would have seen an incredibly competent mother of 3 under 15 months, organising fundraising events and going to coffee mornings and expertly breastfeeding twins and bottle feeding the toddler. And I just was so broken and chaotic underneath.
Who knew that
Nobody.
You were like this?
Nobody knew. I didn't know. There was such a disconnect. So I had severe postnatal depression, but I didn't know that. And what was unusual for me looking back is that I knew that I was at risk of postnatal depression. And I had a conversation with my health visitor while I was still pregnant with my second set of twins. And I said, I'm really worried that this is going to be very triggering and I'm worried about PMD. She said, absolutely, we're going to be really on this. Don't worry. And so it was something that I'd voiced, I'd articulated, and yet I didn't recognise it and nobody else recognised it. And I used to do those questionnaires that they ask you. And I remember being asked by my doctor whether I'd been crying. I hadn't cried at all. I didn't cry because I was totally numb.
Yeah.
But nobody asked if I was numb. They just asked if I
You
cried a
cried.
lot. And then there's a question that goes something like, do you ever feel like things are totally hopeless for no reason whatsoever? And I used to think, well, no, I do think they're hopeless, but it's not for no reason.
No,
But,
I've
very
got a
good
great reason.
So I just didn't pass the test for depression. I never cried. I was brilliantly competent. So nobody saw it. And then I started to sort of lose my mind a little bit. I remember sitting in the car, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the engine to start. And I couldn't remember the steps. Do you put the key in first? Do you use the pedals? And that's when I started thinking, I think I might be unwell. And then while I was pregnant, because we were all so desperate to get more time with these babies before they were born than we'd had the last time, I used to cross the days off in the calendar. And it was a habit that I'd carried on doing. And so every morning I would put a big line through the day before. And I remember doing that. And the babies were 4 months old, maybe. And thinking, oh, well, why am I crossing these days off? There's nothing in the future anymore. We're not working towards anything. Everything felt so empty and so flat. And that was the day that I went to the doctor. And again, no tears, and just said, I think I have postnatal depression. And I took antidepressants, the only time I've ever taken them, and they were miraculous. I was told, give it 10 days and then you might start to feel something. And on day 10, it was like a switch. It was like a chemical switch had happened. And I was still sad. I was still grieving, but I didn't have that hormonal imbalance that so many women suffer from after giving birth.
What would you say for people going through? Should they seek help in those early days?
My advice would be more directed at the people who have high achieving women in their life. And if you have a woman in your life who has just given birth, who is really competent, really good at stuff, gets stuff done, doesn't ask for help, as a rule, just check in with them, because we're not always all right underneath.
Alex died on 10th of December 2006. And of course, then people think after a certain amount of time that perhaps you're over it, and it's something you never, ever get over. You probably just get used to it. What helps you today in those dark moments?
It helps a lot that the dark moments are far fewer than they used to be. I think a lot about what I have. I am hugely, hugely lucky to have had 4 children, to have 3 children now, to have learned everything I've learned about resilience, strength, recovery from grief. Talking helps a lot. Writing helps even more. And I would always advise people to write, to process their emotions. And I think grief in particular, because there is a social expectation around grief that we should be over it. And grief for a child, I think, is particularly complex because people really don't like talking about it. We're pretty good as a society when somebody's mother or father dies. We're really good at supporting people whose elderly parents have died. You know, we feel very comfortable about that. It's the natural order of things. It's sad. We say things like they had a good innings, which actually is horribly insensitive because your innings are never quite long enough. But we are desperately uncomfortable if someone's lost a child. And so we like to ease our own comfort by making sure that they're much better. They're getting through it, getting over it. And historically, there's always been this attitude that you can have other children or you have other children. People would say to me, well, thank goodness you still have his brother. And I sort of know where they're coming from. I understand that it's coming from a place of good-heartedness. But gosh, children are not dispensable or replaceable. It's not okay. You don't say, oh, you lost your mum, but you've still got your dad, or you lost your husband, but you can probably find another one.
No.
It's just an extraordinary, weird reaction that we have, that we want to fill this space that grief causes with platitudes. And of course, there's only one thing to say when someone tells you they've lost someone, and it's, I'm so sorry this has happened to you.
I don't know if you've come across Ben Goldsmith, who lost his daughter Iris, aged 15, in a horrible accident. And he said that there's a time and a place for friends to say sorry. But he said, if I'm out having an evening at the pub with some friends and someone comes up to me and says, I'm sorry about Iris, he said, I just want to pack up and I'll go home straight away.
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's the end of the evening. Even though he knows that they're doing it nice, kindly. And then Jason Watkins, who's a patron of child bereavement, He described losing his daughter Maudie, the feeling of it, as a big black circle right in front of his face. And so when people don't talk about it, he said, I think they feel that then I'm going to be reminded of it. But he said it's front and center of every moment of every day of my life. And he described the circle as it shrinks over time so you can look around it, but it stays central and in the front. So his view was, you can't upset me by mentioning her because she's there all the time. What would you advise?
Loss is universal, grief is personal and unique to the person experiencing it. And we will all say the wrong things at some point. In a way, the odds are stacked against a grief supporter because it is potluck as to whether what you say works. There are days where you could say to me, I'm so sorry, and that would be the right thing to say. And the following day, it might be the wrong thing because I'm out having a drink, I'm enjoying myself, I'm smiling, I'm laughing, and suddenly it's been pressed up against me again. And that is a really uncomfortable thing to happen because it immediately makes one feel really guilty because there you are having a good time and you're catapulted back to a dark place and made to feel that perhaps this is inappropriate to be out having a good time. But then if you don't say anything, it might just be a moment where I'm thinking, nobody remembers what's happened. Nobody thinks of Alex anymore. So my take on it is, as a grief supporter, as a friend to someone in grief, you just have to take that on the chin. You have to accept that you might say the wrong thing and you have to keep trying and you just have to be there for your friend.
Is there anything before we move on that we haven't mentioned that you'd like to mention?
I think just that the book that I wrote, I Promise It Won't Always Hurt Like This, is obviously about my experience of grief. And that predominantly is the grief for my son, but also the grief for my father who died soon afterwards and for friends that I've lost. What it is it's a conversation about grief in its totality and the recovery through grief, because what I noticed about my grief and in talking to other people about theirs is that it is this long journey. The word journey is really overused, possibly when we're talking about emotional things that we go through, but it really does feel like a physical journey that we go on. And I think of it often a little bit like a train journey where you're absorbed in a book or a conversation with someone and you look out of the window after you've been travelling for some time and the landscape is totally different. It was trees and fields when you left and now it's skyscrapers, and you don't know at what point it changed from one to the other. You just know that it's different now. And that is what my grief is like now. It is just very different to how it was 18 years ago. And that's why I was able to write this book and look at the length of that journey and the things that had happened along the way. I wouldn't have been able to have written this book immediately after Alex died. I needed to live through my grief in order to talk to other people about it.
Well, you have these small children. You still carry on working on the police force. And then you decide to take a break because even without your grief, it's a lot to be dealing with.
There was a big moment that made me leave. I was preparing for my chief inspector role and I was working in this very demanding job. The children were at home with a nanny. And in preparation for this promotion, I had to do something called a 360-degree feedback.
Yes.
Appraisal. You will be very familiar with this. You give these questionnaires to all the people you work with at different levels and they fill it out. You get this report written by a management consultant, actually, on what you're like as a person, as a colleague. And I did this process, and it's a really brutal process, but incredibly useful for self-development. And when I got this report, it was glowing. It was brilliant. There were obviously things I could do to work on myself, but it talked about how I had endless energy, how my door was always open. I made time for people. I was enthusiastic, just all the good stuff. And I was so proud of this. And I took it home and I showed my husband. And he read it and he said, yeah, this is amazing. He said, who's this woman? I don't recognise her at all.
Oh, wow.
And we talked a lot. And I realised something which I am not alone in doing, and many women in particular will relate to it. I realised that I used all the best bits of me for my colleagues and for members of the public. And then I brought the leftovers home to my family because I wasn't full of energy at home and I didn't make time for people. I was irritated and grumpy and busy and tired and always thinking about work. And look, I'm a feminist through and through. And I firmly believe that women can have the career and they can have the family and they can absolutely do everything they want to do. At that particular moment, for me, for my family, it wasn't working. I didn't want to be that person at home and I hadn't seen it. And maybe if I hadn't lost a child, I might have found a different way of regaining some balance. But I had buried a child and I was very lucky to still have 3 children that I wasn't seeing, and I needed to make a dramatic change and I needed to make it right then and there. And so I left the police. I didn't go part-time. I handed my warrant card in and I left. It sounds ridiculous to say it, but it was like another grief.
Yes, I'm sure.
This was my identity. This was what I was good at. It was so hard to walk away.
I think everyone does that, men and women. You can't be grumpy in the workplace. You have to do your best in front of people you don't know very well. It's the people that you love the most, who are closest to you, that you treat the worst. I know that I'd speak to my parents and I'd tell them all the rubbish and I'd dump it on them and I'd then go out and be great to face them. And they thought I was going to jump off a bridge. So I think it's a very normal thing. Also, then feeling grief over losing that, because it is your whole identity.
Yeah.
I remember when I gave up work to have children and I had no idea how much of my self-esteem was pegged
Oh my gosh,
on
yes.
what I said I did for a living.
Yes.
And then suddenly it was taken away and I was completely at sea. I was lucky that I could have the option to make that choice, but I had no idea until it went how much it meant to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really big decision, not least because I couldn't afford to stop work. I was the bigger wage earner of the 2 of us. We had a mortgage to pay, bills. I had to earn money. And the only thing I thought I could do and do from home around the children's naps and nursery times was to write. Because I'd started writing before I left the police. Just for me, I'd started a blog. And at the time, blogs weren't quite, nowadays everyone has a Substack, don't they? But this was 2008. I'd started blogging about motherhood, postnatal depression, grief. Later on, some of the funny things that happened, and my blog gained an audience and I was starting to make a little bit of money from it in advertising and a little bit of sponsored content. My children laugh now when I tell them that I was an influencer, that I was one of the very, very early parent influencers. They think it's hysterical. But I had this tiny bit of income from that, and that blog had resulted in me being offered a column in Cotswold Life magazine, a column I then went on to write for a decade. And so at the time I left the police, I think I was earning maybe £150, £200 a month, which was not nearly enough. But I approached this career change in a very logical way, that I thought there is income there. And so all I have to do is scale it up. That's it. There's one editor, the Cotswold Life editor, who is paying me to write. It follows then that there will be other editors who will pay me to write. And so it just felt like a very straightforward, not an easy challenge, but straightforward. And I remember telling some friends, some baby friends, NCT friends, about this big career change and saying, I'm going to write. And their response was awful. There was a sort of a patronising kind of head tilt, as though it was just a hobby. You're talking about trying to make a hobby a job. And they all suggested that maybe there were other things I could do instead, and maybe I should go part-time in the police. I didn't see it as being impossible. And I thought, well, if I'd said to them, I'm going to leave the police, I'm going to go into teaching, they would be wholly supportive of that.
Yes.
And there would be a defined career structure. I would need to go and do some kind of course, get some work experience. And so that's how I approached this. I learned a lot. I pitched to editors. I didn't once say, I'm having this big career change or I'm trying to be a writer. I just said, I'm a writer. This is my idea. This is why I'm the only person who can write this for you. And the very first pitch that I sent was to The Guardian, and it landed. And I wrote an article for The Guardian.
What was your article about?
It was about leap day birthdays. So my second set of twins were born on leap day. The thing about being a freelance writer is you do have to find ideas that only you can write, because otherwise they can just give it to someone in-house.
Yeah.
So a lot of my early articles were hinged upon personal experience or my life. And so I wrote about leap day birthdays in general, found 3 case studies, used my own twins, and bang, an article in The Guardian. So I forged this portfolio career, they would call it, I suppose. Bits of journalism, bits of copywriting, which pays a lot better than journalism. I wrote social media content, discovered I was really good at writing social media content and building social media platforms. And so that led to me being headhunted by Philips, the electronics firm. And I spent 2 years running their social media channels. So I was doing all these things around the kids when they were asleep, basically, or at nursery. And then in the evenings, when they were in bed and my husband was on nights, I started writing a novel. The first novel that I actually wrote was a romantic comedy, which seems so odd now because I'm so firmly entrenched in the crime and thriller world. I wrote a romantic comedy. It was funny, but it didn't have a great plot. But what it did do was get me an agent.
So you got an agent on the first book, the previous book to I Let You Go.
Yeah, well, I started working with an agent who really liked my writing, and they had interest from a publisher, and I was terribly excited. I'd only just left the police, and I thought, this is it. I'm going to be a published author with this romantic comedy, which was called Hot Property. It was about a woman returning from maternity leave to her job as an estate agent. It wasn't very good.
It's hard to get an agent, and I know because I write, and have a publisher interested.
Yeah. And so then another of these big moments happened for me, because life would have been very different, I think. The agent said, look, we don't think you should progress these conversations with this publisher. We think that this is not the book to launch your writing career with. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a fun book. It will sell a few thousand copies. It will then disappear. But it will define your career, because this will be your debut novel. Do you want this to be your defining novel? And it was such good advice, because I didn't, because it wasn't anything spectacular. I'd just written it. It was fun. It wasn't my best work by any means. And I felt I had more in me than this particular book. And so I took their advice and I put it to one side, and I wrote I Let You Go. And I Let You Go then went on to sell 1 million copies and be translated into 40 languages and changed my life.
It was the Sunday Times, New York Times bestseller, fastest selling title by a new UK crime writer in 2015. And it won the Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Novel of the Year in 2016. And I'm just going to also read back to you a couple of the comments that are on the back. Chilling with a killer twist. Oh my God, twist. I nearly fell off the sofa. #genius. A terrific, compelling book with a twist that floored me. Just finished. What an amazing twist. Couldn't put it down. One of the best books I've read. So I read those, and then I was looking for the twist, and I thought, oh, I'm going to find it in advance. And then when it came, I had to put the book down and just wander around a bit. So I just thought, how did I not see that coming? And it really shook me. It was just incredible. So I want to go back into how you wrote that first book, because what was your starting point? What gave you that killer idea?
It was the twist. I wanted to know whether you could do what I wanted to do to a reader. It seemed impossible, but wouldn't it be amazing if I could pull that off? And It's funny because I'm not going to give spoilers for that particular twist, but sometimes when I'm thinking about a twist, I approach it from really quite a scientific point of view, from a logical point of view, like I was saying about career changes, and you follow steps and you'll get to where you want to go. And so if I'm trying to make a reader think that story A is actually story B, then I see it as a sort of a Venn diagram. There will be a point where those two stories cross over, and the bit in the middle applies to both stories. And so that's what I have to work with. And what that does is it remains honest. It's not tricking the reader, it's not lying, it's just working with a space that could mean one thing, but could also mean another.
So P.D. James, she always used to start with a place. And Richard Osman, when I listened to him the other day, he started with a residential home. So he started with a place. Do you then start with the twist?
Not always. So I Let You Go and Let Me Lie started with firm twists. I'm editing a book at the moment, which will be out next year, called It's Not What You Think. And that started with the twist as well. I'm very excited about that one. And then other books start with a concept. So, for example, my second book, I See You, is about routine. It's about the concept that we find routine very familiar, that the more familiar our routines are, the safer we feel. The paradox being, of course, that that's a really unsafe way to lead your life, because if you know what you're doing tomorrow, then someone else probably knows it too and can use it against you. So that novel started with that concept. Others start with a place. Hostage is set on a non-stop 20-hour flight from London to Sydney. I was on a different flight, but I was on a very long flight, and immediately just had an idea for a locked room thriller set on an aeroplane. So they all start in different ways, but they're all challenges. They're all a puzzle that I need to solve for myself before I can give you the same puzzle.
I didn't realise you had an agent already before you started writing the first one, but presumably you started writing it and you had time. There was no particular pressure from that agent at that point, but I may be wrong. But having had that incredible success with the first one, I would then think that writing the second is huge pressure in contrast, because you've got a whole bunch of readers out there who are waiting for you to do exactly the same thing again. And the agent now is onto a really good thing.
Oh, it was awful. It was really, really hard. Proper sort of, oh, my diamond shoes are too tight sort of problem. A nice problem to have, but really, really hard. Initially, all the good news that came in was really exciting. You know, oh, you've been picked for the Richard and Judy Book Club. Oh, you've sold to Japan. All these crazy things. And then they started to feel really almost unpleasant. I would get another foreign rights deal news and feel a bit sick, because that meant there was another country who would be waiting for the next novel. And more people, and the more reviews I Let You Go got, the more pressure it felt. So it was really hard. And I wrote my second book, which was not I See You. I wrote the second book and edited it with my editor, and we went out for lunch to talk about it. And she said, how do you feel about this book? And I said, I like it. I said, my only concern is I think it's not quite as strong as I Let You Go. And I know what I was doing. I was willing her to reassure me in the same way that you might put on a dress that you know maybe isn't great and say, what do you think? And you really want your friends to go, it's great.
Yes.
She didn't say the dress looked fab. She said, no, I don't think it's as strong either. And I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? What
That's
do we
an
do
entire
now?
book, and it's done as well.
Yeah, and it's 9 months of work. She's a brilliant editor. She said, don't worry, we've got this. You've got two options. We carry on working on it until it's strong enough, or you throw it away and you start again. You write something different. And the thing about having a really big success with your debut novel is the stakes are really high. When you've had, I don't know, a dozen novels out, like now, if I wrote a novel, I hope this won't happen, but if I wrote a novel that perhaps was just not quite as good, most of my readers would forgive me. Okay, because they've loved my other books. Maybe they didn't love this one. There are loads of authors that I think, I didn't love that book as much. But as a whole, we love their work. When you've only got one book, you don't get a second chance. They read that second novel, they go, oh, she was a one-hit wonder, and your career is over. You don't sell very well in the supermarkets. They don't take another book from you. You just drop off the face of the earth. So the second book, that sounds maybe a bit catastrophic, but that is kind of how it works. So the second book is super important. And the problem with my second novel was that however much I polished it, however rounded I made the characters and exciting I made the plot, the underlying concept of it just wasn't there. And so I threw it away. And instead, I wrote what I thought was going to be my third novel, which was I See You.
So did you already have the idea for I See You at that point?
And I knew it was stronger. Literally the next day, I threw the novel away. Metaphorically, it exists on my computer. I had a bit of a cry in the same way that, you know, if you end a relationship that you know is not right, it can be devastating, yet still be the right thing to do. And so the next day I picked myself up and I started a new book.
Which I read. I have to say, never have I been so happy to have so many train delays last Sunday, because I was reading it and while everyone else was effing and blinding and I can't believe this is happening again, I was like, well, I'm pretty happy because I got this book and I'm just going to keep reading it. And so, yeah, what a second one. I mean, that was, again, such a unique idea. I watch a lot of crime on television and I do read a lot of crime novels, and they're clever ways of rehashing things. Whereas what happens with yours is a brand new idea.
I hope so. I think that there are limited stories actually in the world when you break it down. And in the crime thriller genre, what we're often writing about, particularly in the psychological suspense space, is extraordinary things happening to ordinary people and exploring the things that people are frightened of. And there are lots of books writing about similar topics. But yes, I hope that I approach things in a fresh way. Ultimately, I write the sorts of books I love to read and just hope that other people love them too.
Well, they are just extraordinary. Let Me Lie, again, massive twist in the middle, and then it just keeps twisting and twisting and twisting. I think the strapline is wonderful. The police say it was suicide. Anna says it was murder. They're both wrong. That's really good. Amor Towles, author of A Gentleman in Moscow and Lincoln Highway, and he says that he comes up with ideas all the time. It's something that he does when his brain is idle. How do you come up with these ideas?
They just happen. I can't explain it. I don't generate ideas. I just see things. The way Hostage started was that I was on a flight to San Francisco, which is quite a long flight from the UK, and I was with 3 children, which makes it even longer.
Really long.
So this is a few years ago. We had no Wi-Fi. I was thinking about how few places there are where you're totally cut off from the world, and how I wouldn't know if there was a big drama happening on the ground, and equally they wouldn't know if there was something happening in air. And by the time I got off the plane, I had a full synopsis of what would become Hostage, which is about a flight attendant being forced to choose between her family's safety back at home or the safety of 300 passengers on the flight. And that sort of moral dilemma really appeals to me. So sometimes it's that sort of thing. And then other times, a few years ago, I think now, I saw an advert for a village for sale in the south of France. A whole village, 36 buildings, abandoned, the whole place needing restoration, repopulation. And I thought, gosh, that's an interesting start to a novel. And it was for sale for something like 200,000. I could imagine 3 couples deciding to leave their lives in the UK, sell their houses, spend the money on buying this village. And then, of course, because I write crime, things would go horribly, horribly wrong. And lots of people lying to each other and murder everywhere. And I don't know yet whether I will write a book about that. I don't know if it will be the starting point for a thriller. But it's just something I will store it away. And then what will happen is I will think of a twist, perhaps, or some big moment. And the 2 things will come together. And suddenly I will have the basis of a book.
And are you sitting down, racking your brains for that? Or are you just sort of out and about and these things come to you and you mull them over?
They're sort of brewing in the background. So right now, for example, I am on tour with Other People's Houses, which is my 2025 thriller. I am on the first round of edits for my 2026 thriller, It's Not What You Think.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so that's done already.
I think I have the idea for my 2027 novel. And then I'm also writing a couple of other side projects, which are around the same genre, but slightly different. So I have all these things going on at any one time. And the cycle just repeats. And so if we were to grab a coffee this time next year, I would then be on tour with next year's novel and writing the next. And so by then I would be having the idea for 2028 or 2029's novel, which may or may not involve a village being bought in the south of France. It might be something totally different.
Can you take us through when you actually then have that idea? How do you do it?
I have mulled it over for a time. And so I've been living with this idea while I've been writing other books. And so this beginning stage is not really the beginning. I then get a big sheet of paper or a whiteboard, big fan of wallpaper, spread out, lining paper, either pinned to the wall or perhaps on the kitchen table, and I will draw the 3-act structure, which is well-established framework for writing a novel. And then I'll start dropping in the big events that I see happening. This is not a task that takes my full focus for a period of time. It's something that will be overlapping another novel. So right now I am immersed in edits and I couldn't plot another novel at the same time. Next month, when I'm just working on the finer points of next year's novel, I can then free up the creative space that I need to do big chunky plotting. So I'm doing this over the course of a few weeks while I'm doing other things. As I walk past, I'm adding a post-it note here, a post-it note there. As the story starts to take shape, I'm also thinking about who I want to put in these situations. If I've got a locked room thriller situation happening on a plane, who is the person I want to have to deal with that? Whose life would be upended the most by this situation? And then when the story is pretty much solid, then I sit down at my desk and then I create a table, a word table. It's very low tech. And I start to shape it into chapters. And what I'm looking for there is pacing. I'm asking myself, what happens? It's a little bit like a domino effect. This event happens. What does that cause to then happen? Because what you can't have in a thriller is just lots of disconnected, exciting events. It's not satisfying for the reader. It just feels like you've just thrown everything into the novel. What you need is cause and effect. And so I'm looking at that as I'm putting plot events into this word table. But I'm also doing something else, which I don't know how many writers do this. I have a column that I call the reader's journey. And I write in there how you are going to feel. So this is a reaction that you won't have for another 18 months to 2 years, but I'm telling you what it is. I'm charting who you trust, who you don't trust, whether you're sad, happy, surprised, what your reaction is, what is your emotional journey throughout this novel, because it's manipulation in the nicest possible way. If I know how I want you to react, then I can make sure I give you the most exciting, satisfying read.
That's so interesting. And then will you actually have every chapter mapped out by the time you sit down and start writing it?
I will, yes. I'll have the whole story mapped out. And I know that lots of writers will talk about how, I couldn't possibly plot the whole thing out. It would then feel really boring for me. I need to be as surprised as the reader does. Different strokes for different folks. I find it incredibly creative to focus on the plotting first. And then when I start my first draft, I can immerse myself in the world I'm creating and I don't have to worry that I'm going off-piste. So for me, it's a very similar process to perhaps an architect drawing up plans for a house. But then in the building of that house, you can change your mind. You have bigger windows. You decide that actually you want the kitchen over here, and you discover that there are pipes that mean you can't dig down the way you wanted to, and so you have to adapt. So it is a flexible process, but I could no more write a novel without a plan than I could drive across Europe without a map.
But you know your characters actually pretty well before you even start then.
Yeah, I do, but it is the characters that will cause me to take a diversion, because inevitably, as I'm writing, the characters take shape more and it doesn't fit what I wanted them to do. And so that's fine. They lead that story, because if the reader doesn't care about the characters, then even the most exciting plot in the world isn't going to be enough to keep them turning the pages.
Other People's Houses with DC Fionn Morgan, even though I read it not in order, it was just perfect as a standalone.
Absolutely. And I find it really difficult as a reader if a series novel demands that you read them all in order, because we can't always do that. And it's nice, I think, when you can just dive straight into a book.
Yes. And what I loved about all of your books, not only is it so twisty-turny, and I have yet to know where it's going to go, and I certainly didn't in this one either. In fact, I think I probably suspected everyone except the person. Your characters are so relatable, and there was one in particular I have to mention, Ali, who I've come across a few Alis, and then sometimes I think I'm a bit like Ali.
You are definitely not Ali.
So that is the joy, is that you are being swept along on this roller coaster. It feels like being swept along by people that you really like, a lot of them.
People people
Yes.
that you recognise from real life. Because for me as a reader, I love watching or reading thrillers where the ordinary person is the one that we're rooting for. I enjoy things like Jason Bourne, James Bond, but let's face it, the odds are in their favour, aren't they? You don't go into a battle scene and think, I wonder who's going to win this.
No.
Whereas when our champion is an ordinary person who is flawed, who we relate to, I think that is much more exciting, because you just don't know how it's going to end.
No, you don't know. And there was a point towards the end of that where I thought, oh no, you can't actually end it like this. And I'm not going to say whether you did or not, but I was seriously upset about the way it was. But this particular series now, because that's the third in the series, and it's being adapted for television.
It is, although, who knows whether we'll get there. I'm very sanguine now about TV options, because books get optioned all the time and very few get made. I think when we sold the option for I Let You Go back in 2014, maybe, I practically went out and bought my red carpet dress, was practicing my BAFTA speech. And 10 years on, we still haven't got the green light for that. It's been under option, I can't remember how many times. It's a deeply frustrating industry. And so, yes, the Fionn series is under option. It's being adapted. Who knows what will happen? It would be lovely to see something made, but I try not to think too much about things in life that are out of my control.
When you've got that first draft done, before you give it to your agent, what sort of checks and balances happen?
Nobody sees it before my editor and agent, and it goes to them simultaneously. I just write it. The only contact I have with anyone about the novel is research help. And so I'm writing a book at the moment, the editing, so next year's book, It's Not What You Think. I have leaned really heavily on some former colleagues. I have a WhatsApp group called Murder, does what it says on the tin, and it is populated by heads of departments. So I've got an assistant chief constable there, I've got head of forensics, all sorts of people. They're brilliant. They're all women, actually, coincidentally. And when I first had the idea for this novel and this ridiculously audacious twist that I'm doing in it, I assembled this team, and they're all really busy people, but they're also book lovers. And
it's fun for them, and it's something they know about as well. Right. They can help.
Absolutely. And so we started off with a Zoom call. I sent them all cocktails by post, which I find is a very effective way of getting a brainstorming meeting going. And we did what we used to call, probably still do call in the police, a paper feed exercise. I walked them through this fictional crime and asked them how they would handle it. And so what it did was It reminded me of lines of inquiry that I might have forgotten. I've been out of the police for a decade or more now. And also, of course, things move on. And so it was really good to have that up-to-date stuff. But it also enables me to test the twist on them. So when I was then able to say, but then this happens. And I just remember one of the senior officers going, oh, fuck. And I said, right, so how would you deal with that? And there was just absolute silence before they were, okay, well, I guess we've got to, and we were off again. So that's been really fun. And now when I just need a little, what am I going to do with this? I fire off a message to the WhatsApp group and get a response. So I'm very lucky to have that direct channel. But otherwise, nobody knows anything about the story. If I got stuck, I could speak to my editor, but I just get that first draft done really as quickly as I can, which for me is about 4 months.
That's quick. That's really quick.
It's quick, but it's in terrible shape when I finish it. It only really becomes the novel it's going to be by the end of my second draft.
They've seen the first draft. Do they give you some input, structural input and things, and then you go back and do the second one?
Yeah, so that's where I am now. So I handed it in at the end of January. I had my edit notes 2 weeks ago. And I would say 90% of what was in the edit notes is what I expected. Let's strengthen this character. Let's tighten this bit of pacing. And then 10% I could never have seen myself. And it relates to the structure of the novel and the narrative impetus that carries the reader from page 1 to page whatever, 350. That doesn't quite work as hard as it could at the moment. And so my challenge then was to work out how to solve it. And so I sat with the notes for about 10 days while I worked through this problem in my head, had a call with my editors and said, right, this is my proposed solution. This is the structure in the new draft. What do you think? And we talked it through. I got the go ahead for that. And so now I have to rewrite it. And although it's only 10% of the editorial notes that's big, that actually equates to a really, really big rewrite. So I would say maybe 30,000 words are going completely and being replaced. And then I'll be reworking some of the rest of it. But I've got quite a lot of work to do, and I've got 3.5 weeks to do it.
3.5 weeks to do it?
Yes. It's fine. There's nothing like a deadline for focusing the mind.
No,
right?
That's true. Okay, well, I'm going to speed up with my questions so you can get on and do it. Manifesting. It's the trendy thing. We're all supposed to be manifesting what we want in life. And my happiest times with my children, so I've been writing mysteries for teenagers, was the end of the day reading stories together. And so when I think about why I'm trying to write, it's that moment where someone's looking with a little side lamp and reading something avidly, or with a parent and having all those little lights everywhere. And that's what I would love in the future to happen. It was really interesting what you said earlier about the fact that when everyone was saying, oh, you can't do that, that's not a good idea. And you thought, why not? So I wondered whether you manifest.
Isn't it interesting how we feel slightly embarrassed about manifesting? And yet, if we were talking about goal setting, all over it, perfectly happy. There is no difference, is there, between goal setting and manifesting? I've always been a goal setter. And my agent laughs because one of the first questions I asked her was, what does success look like in this industry? And she said, I've never been asked that by a brand new author. I think that's the frustrated management consultant coming out in me. And so I'm a real goal setter, and I think that is manifesting. So yes, I manifest. And actually, interestingly, recently I have started doing that in a more spiritual way, I suppose. Is that the right word? I'm not sure. I started a program that I'm sure you've heard of called The Artist's Way.
Yes.
And I have always been maybe a little bit I just felt it wasn't for me. And then I started it, and I'm just going to tell you, it's been transformational. I think it's extraordinary. I was feeling quite creatively stifled, and I had fallen out of love with writing, which is a huge problem when you are a writer. I still had the ideas, but I just didn't want to write them.
When was this?
Oh, it started in the pandemic. And I think it started because I wasn't meeting readers. Because although I write for me and I write because I can't not write, that interaction with readers and that feedback loop is a really important part of my job and what drives me to finish those books. It's like you imagining those children reading before they go to sleep. And suddenly I didn't have it because we weren't doing events. Yeah, since then it's been harder work. So the books have still happened and the reviews have been the same. And, nothing has changed on the outside, but the process of getting there has been less enjoyable. So I started The Artist's Way last autumn. Transformational. I have more ideas than ever before. I can't wait to get to my desk. I love the writing process. I'm writing faster. Anyway, as part of that process, I started journaling. And I've never journaled before. Years ago, I kept a diary, but journaling has now become an essential part of my morning routine, to the point where I had to leave for the airport at 4:30 in the morning a couple of months ago to go to Emirates Lit Fest. And I set my alarm for 3 a.m. so that I could do my morning pages before I got out of bed. So I wake up, I have a kettle in my room so that I don't get distracted downstairs by dogs and phones. And I make a cup of tea, I light a candle, I put on Radio 4 very quietly, and I sit in bed in dim lighting and I do my morning pages. And in those morning pages, a lot of it is what I have to do. It's a to-do list, it's my thoughts on yesterday, it's all sorts. But I always finish by goal setting / manifesting, delete as necessary. I visualize what I want from the day, from the week, for just the opportunities that I want to come my way. And those are really different. Sometimes those are things I want for my children, that I want happiness, or for the people that I love in my friendship group. But sometimes they're very clear. I want the Sunday Times top 10 for this book. I want this side project that I'm writing secretly, longhand, in evenings, in hotel bars, to be a global sensation and net me a 7-figure deal from the States. Sometimes they are big, big professional goals. And sometimes I just want today to be calm and without drama. I want an early night and a good night's sleep. So it really depends. But I am a big fan of goal setting / manifesting. And I don't think any of us should be ashamed for striving for the good things in life.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you what your most helpful daily habit is.
I think that's it. And it's new. It's 4 or 5 months old, but it feels more entrenched than anything else I do.
And for other writers out there like me, what advice could you give us?
So read a lot and read outside of your genre. I meet lots of thriller writers who only ever read crime thrillers. And I always tell them, go and read really good romance to learn how to build character relationships, and go and read really good sci-fi to understand how to create a world that the reader believes in. So read outside your genre. The biggest tip really is to just finish what you're writing. Among other things, I'm a coach for The Novelry, which is an online writing school. And the number of people who start a novel and don't finish it is far, far greater than those who do. And so the biggest help you can give yourself is to simply press on until you get to the end, because that puts you already so far ahead all the other people who say they want to write a novel.
Okay, that's great advice. I love your Instagram. And there was a particular post that I thought was wonderful. And it was you were wandering around your house and picking up things that people had dropped and saying, I have plans for the day, and then they always get derailed. And of course, I totally understand that, because that happens to me all the time. But at the end of it, you said, I love my life. I thought that was really quite amazing that you have got to this place in your life when you've had so much sadness and trauma, and that's not going to go away. We'll have that with you always. But that you've got yourself into a place where you've brought up your children and you were a huge success in the police force. You've now just hugely successful and entertaining so many of us and giving us all so much enjoyment with your wonderful books. And you've managed to get to the stage where you say, I love my life. Often, I think it's the people who have the least to complain about who complain the most. But I just thought that was a wonderful thing for you to say, and a huge triumph that you're in a position to say it. And so what final advice would you give on how to make our days happier, how to acknowledge what we have and do life a bit better?
Sometimes I think that those of us who have been through the worst possible trauma are very fortunate because the worst has already happened. And so I suppose what I do is it's counting your blessings. That's such a trite piece of advice to end this lovely conversation on. But I honestly believe that if you just notice the little things, it makes you feel so much better. And I am so lucky. And I think any of us who are still standing after loss or after trauma should just look in the mirror and remind ourselves of how incredibly strong we are to have survived that. And that in itself is something to be incredibly grateful for.
Well, thank you so much, Clare, for coming today. And I know you're right in the middle of this whirlwind tour. You're all over the place, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm going all over. I've actually got a chance to take a breath now while I do my edits. And then I've got Estonia and Greece, and I'm not quite sure where the rest of this year.
Well, good luck with all of that. And thank you for these amazing books that I have literally devoured and will continue to devour. And I knew I was going to have a lovely time talking to you today. And
Thank
I have
you.
so
It's
much.
been wonderful.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B, Head of Marketing, to all of the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.